Chapter 241, How to Break the Situation. Even Zhu Tui himself would be afraid if he were to train at full strength. It was not because he was too serious, but because it was too expensive. 2 weeks ago, when Zhu Tui had strengthened his genetic base point related to mental perception to level to silver, he had only consumed 7 bottles of level E energy restoration elixirs in a full cultivation cycle. After that, he used a higher grade level D energy restoration elixir to increase his cultivation efficiency. A complete cultivation cycle would consume about 90% of the energy of a bottle of level D energy restoration elixir. He would have to waste 10%. It was used to gain weight. But what about 2 weeks later today? Zhu Tui had already used 1 bottle of level D energy restoration elixir and 2 bottles of level E energy restoration elixir during the entire cultivation cycle. A complete cultivation cycle costs 60,000 yuans. Zhu Tui felt that he was no longer eating money. He was really burning money. However, the cultivation efficiency was also excellent. If he used level E energy restoration elixirs as units, Zhu Tui would be able to consume 12 bottles of level E energy restoration elixirs in his current cultivation cycle. 2 weeks ago, he had only consumed 7.5 bottles per cultivation cycle. Based on this data, his cultivation efficiency had increased by 80% compared to 2 weeks ago. Of course, it was not purely because of Zhu Tui's improvement. It had the effect of using a higher grade level D energy restoration elixir. However, compared to when he strengthened his genetic base point related to mental perception to level 2, his cultivation efficiency had increased by 80%. To put it in an exaggerated manner, it was doubled. Zhu Tui used a total of 31 bottles of level E energy restoration elixirs to strengthen his genetic base point related to mental perception to level 2. With this as a reference, he felt that he would be able to strengthen the 9th reaction speed type genetic base point to level 2. After consuming about 30 bottles of level E energy restoration elixir, Zhu Tui cultivated with all his focus. Other than the necessary tasks, he spent most of his time recovering his mind power while he slept. Cultivating consumed his mind power. He continued to cycle between these 2 tasks. Under normal circumstances, there would be a cultivation cycle every 8.5 hours. Zhu Tui was woken up by Zhong Ziqiang's call at 9 o'clock the next morning. It was not the good news of the supernatural branch challenging the rankings. "Brother Zhu, I'm already in position. I'll help you keep an eye on them. You can do your thing." Zhong Ziqiang's voice was loud and clear. Zhu Tui responded. He did not plan to go to the Longhu arena. As long as there were no accidents, Wen Xiao would not let his students challenge the rankings in advance. He should be able to drag out the delaying tactic to the end. Since Zhong Ziqiang was watching for him, Zhu Tui decided to have a meal and continue cultivating. Up until now, he had used up 23 bottles of level E energy restoration elixirs to strengthen his 9th reaction type genetic base point. After eating, he went back and continued to cultivate. After all, he had just slept for almost 6 hours and his mind power had almost recovered. At noon, another cultivation cycle ended. Zhu Tui had already accumulated 35 bottles of level E energy restoration elixirs. The amount invested has exceeded the previous amount. However, he still did not succeed. This consumption was much greater than strengthening his genetic base point related to mental perception to level 2. Of course, Zhu Tui also had the results of his analysis. First of all, even though Zhu Tui had activated his genetic base points, while he was in the illusory introspective state, his entire genetic chain was being strengthened. However, when others were strengthening and developing, they would distribute all their energy to the genetic chain at a nearly average level. Zhu Tui, on the other hand, could directly send 50% of the energy to the strengthened genetic base points while he was in the illusory introspective state. The remaining genetic base points would take 50%. Secondly, it should be because the number of genetic base points that constituted the genetic chain was different. There were only 6 genetic base points in the genetic ability chain related to mental perception. The genetic ability chain of the time distortion ability had 9 genetic base points. According to the structure theory of the genetic chain, the more genetic base points that formed the genetic chain, the more stable the genetic chain would be. It could be inferred that the more genetic base points that form the genetic chain, the more difficult it would be to strengthen it. In an instant, Zhu Tui thought of the first level of the mind concentration foundation forging technique that he had cultivated. There were 36 genetic base points that formed a genetic chain. However, this did not scare Zhu Tui. He would take his time. According to Luo Shifeng's guess, even if Zhu Tui had a goal in mind to strengthen and develop the 9th reaction type genetic base point, it would probably take him 3 to 5 years before he could strengthen and develop it to the 2nd level and obtain the genetic chain ability. However, Zhu Tui only needed 3 to 4 cultivation cycles to obtain the powerful ability of time distortion. Actually, this was also one of the research problems at the moment. Students and cultivators nowadays all pursued efficiency. If you asked him to spend 3 to 5 years specifically to strengthen and develop genetic base points that were related to reaction speed, very few people would be able to persist. Moreover, ordinary cultivators might spend more time. Therefore, Luo Shifeng was very helpless. It would probably take a long time for this genetic ability related to time distortion to be transformed into research results that the genetic committee recognized. This span of time might take 10 years. It would take at least 3 to 5 years. Of course, Luo Shifeng had already worked hard for 30 years. He would be very willing to spend another 10 years. However, this was still a huge threshold. If one had a professional instructor like Luo Shifeng to guide him and specially train him, it would probably take him a year at most to successfully activate all 9 of the genetic base points. However, after activating all 9 of them, he could only obtain the passive ability to increase his overall reaction speed. If he wanted to obtain the powerful ability of time distortion, he would have to settle down and work hard for 3 to 5 years. Of course, this was normal. The stronger the ability, the harder it was to obtain it. This rule was also applicable to Zhu Tui. He did not succeed in strengthening it after the 3rd cultivation cycle. He continued to sleep during the day. At 7 in the afternoon, he started the 4th cultivation cycle. Zhu Tui felt an explosion when he was more than halfway through the 4th cultivation cycle, after he had consumed about 60% of a bottle of level D energy restoration elixir. It was as if someone had smashed his head with a sledgehammer. His vision turned black and he almost fainted. The pain in his head caused Zhu Tui to fall out of the illusory introspective state. He felt that his nose and lips were wet. He had a nosebleed. The physical reaction this time was even more intense than when he strengthened his main genetic base point related to mental perception to level 2. According to the theoretical analysis Zhu Tui had learned during this period of time, it should be because the overall strength of the genetic chain was not enough. When I strengthen the genetic chains with more genetic base points in the future, I should strengthen the secondary genetic base points appropriately to reduce the risk of strengthening them. Zhu Tui made a note in his cultivation notebook. After cleaning his nosebleed, he could not wait to enter meditation. He immediately switched to the illusory introspective state. Silver. As expected, he had strengthened the 9th reaction type genetic base point to level to silver. He had consumed 41 bottles of level E energy restoration elixir. Then did I obtain the time distortion ability? That was the key. He could only test the time distortion ability in the dormitory. He hung a pen on the clothes rack with a string. Zhu Tui stood in front of it and quickly pushed the pen out. Then, he allowed the pen to stab him. At that moment, Zhu Tui followed Luo Shifeng's instructions and focused his attention on that point. The moment he focused, Zhu Tui suddenly felt that time had slowed down. Time felt like it had stopped. The tip of the pen that was rapidly stabbing towards him suddenly seemed to have stopped. It stopped in its tracks. The moment it stopped, Zhu Tui could make a perfect judgment and reaction. However, this moment was also very short. When the tip of the pen was aimed at Zhu Tui again, he had already turned his body to avoid it. Time distortion obtained. Luo Shifeng's judgment that his 9th reaction type genetic base point was the main genetic base point of this ability was correct. At the same time, Zhu Tui immediately understood what Luo Shifeng had said about this ability after he obtained the time distortion ability. The time in the outside world did not change at all. What had changed or distorted was Zhu Tui's inner domain time. The external performance of this ability was a little like the bullet time in special effects. However, it was not as sick as the movie special effects. Based on Zhu Tui's current understanding, it was extremely good to use it for defense and attack reactions. After some thought, he quickly got up and rushed to the Neurology Research Center. He needed a more detailed test. In any case, Zhu Tui was a special researcher at the Neurology Research Center. He had an identity card and could enter at any time. When he arrived at the Neurology Research Center, Zhu Tui used the equipment there to conduct a full set of tests on himself. The results came in less than half an hour. After the 9th reaction type genetic base point was strengthened to level to silver, the increase in reaction speed was very limited. Yesterday, Zhu Tui's fastest reaction speed when he activated his 9th reaction type genetic base point was 0.1 milliseconds. Now that he had strengthened it to level 2, his fastest reaction speed was 0.08 milliseconds. He still could not catch up to Luo Shifeng. His average reaction speed increased from 0.3 milliseconds to 0.2 milliseconds. His overall reaction speed increased from 0.5 milliseconds to 0.4 milliseconds. However, there was a statistic that gave Zhu Tui a huge surprise. He had tested it multiple times using various methods. His time distortion reaction time was 0.2 milliseconds. It was 4 times faster than Luo Shifeng's time distortion. This also indirectly proved that the 9th genetic base point was the main genetic base point of time distortion. The main genetic base point that could strengthen related abilities was much more beneficial than the secondary genetic base points that could strengthen and develop related abilities. He returned to the dormitory and continued cultivating. Zhu Tui exhausted most of his mind power. He then went through his daily energy field training and studied for another hour before he went to sleep. However, Zhu Tui was still thinking about something before he went to bed. Tomorrow was the last day of the Longhu battle. How should he break through? How could he break when Xiao's stalling tactic?